Morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Welcome to See It, Stop It, Tackling Abuse in Amateur Sports, presented by the Foundation for Global Sports Development and Sidewinder Films. We've gathered today an incredible group of experts and survivors for this two-day symposium, which is really specifically designed to empower coaches, parents, athletes, and administrators to recognize and prevent all forms of abuse in sport. So if you're on the call, if you're on the symposium, you know for sure that sport is a space and was designed to be a space where athletes feel safe and free to be themselves. The Global Sports Development Foundation is committed to ensuring this happens. To end abuse in sport, we must completely shift the culture to make athlete safety and well-being and the total duty of care our top priority. So now it's my pleasure just to quickly present this short message from Dr. Steven Ungerleider, who is the producer of the movie At the Heart of Gold, Inside the USA Gymnastics Scandal, and co-founder of the Foundation for Global Sports Development. Enjoy the video.
Hello, I'm Dr. Steven Ungerleider, co-founder and executive board member for the Foundation for Global Sports Development and Sidewinder Films. As a producer and writer of At the Heart of Gold, Inside the USA Gymnastics Scandal, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this film and join the discussion, since I consider this documentary to be one of the most important projects I've ever worked on. I was a collegiate gymnast, and my love of sports followed me into adulthood and eventually fatherhood. Both of my daughters were also gymnasts. I have dedicated my life as a psychologist to championing programs that offer access to safe, abuse-free sport for youth, which is why learning the details of what happened to these young women was particularly devastating. Prior to embarking on this journey, I'd heard rumors about sexual abuse in elite sport. I was shocked to learn the true extent of the problem as we conducted the research for this film. We knew this story could only be told through the voices of those who lived it, the survivors. These women who came forward with their victim impact statements exemplify courage and are an inspiration to all who hear them speak. Their collective voice has awakened us all to what needs to be done to protect future generations. The work has begun, but there is still a lot more to do, as demonstrated by the ever-increasing number of revelations that have come to light since this landmark case. The film and every conversation it sparks is a tribute to survivors around the world. I want to thank our distinguished moderator and panelists for lending their support to this program. We hope by raising awareness and offering resources, www.
Thank you so much. It's designed to equip you to prevent abuse from happening, recognize the signs of abuse, and then take action. Remember that this discussion may be triggering, so we encourage you to practice self-care. Feel free to anonymously call or text Child Help's hotline. There's a session tomorrow at 12:15 specific time to learn more about national and local resources, training, certifications, and to get answers to pressing questions. If you have questions for our panelists, please enter them using the Q&A feature, and we have our great team behind the scenes manning that Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screens. So I'm going to welcome our participants, first by introducing myself. My name is Dr. Yetzit Wakli. I'm a sports medicine doctor. I'm also the founding director of the Sports Equity Lab, which is an academic lab designed to rid all the inequities within sport, including harassment and abuse, while at the same time, and this is critical, using sport to do the same in society, because that's what it was built for. I'm at Yale University at the School of Public Health, and I'm also at the University of Pittsburgh. The panelists joining me today are amazing. The first one is Kimberly Hurst. She is the founder and CEO of the incredibly courageous to survivors of active and educated Gonzalez and in which Dr.
Thank you, Yetza.
Okay, so I'm gonna start with just like one quick introductory question. And just so you know, for the audience, it's just gonna be a question answer back and forth. So Trinae, I'll start with you. Can you just tell us a little bit more about how you met Kim and how that moment influenced the work you're doing today?
Yeah, meeting Kim was a blessing, but also some of my darkest moments in my life. And thank God for her, because she really understood things that I didn't know that I needed to have, or support that I didn't realize that I was in need of. But how I met Kim, I will try not to cry because I don't mean to be emotional about Kim because she's my favorite. But after our impact statements, particularly my day, one of our survivors from our group had attempted suicide and was put in a space, and she did offer that I could speak to her story, so I just want to put that out there. And then a week later, she was let out and then attempted suicide a second time. And I was really confused at that time because I didn't really understand what we needed, and I just assumed that there were places for sexual assault survivors everywhere, that people were going to be coming out of the doors and support we were going to be given. And you know, our case was coming out in mass, so the quantity of survivors was really overwhelming, I think, for the people that were trying to support us. And so I really just started to reach out myself. How do I help this little girl? How do I support her in this time when she's really suffering really, really badly? And everyone kept telling me, you're in Detroit, you need to talk to Kimberly Hurst. And I'm like, who's this woman? Where do I find her? So I started looking up, at that time it was Wayne County SAFE, which they were the sexual assault forensics examiners in the city of Detroit. And not understanding, you know, what a rape kit was or what kind of things went into that. I didn't quite understand what it was that I needed from her. But I started reaching out to her, and she was helping me look for support around the country for this other survivor. And my one question to her was, why doesn't anybody know about you guys? Like, how come nobody knows? How do we find you? Are there more of you? You know, where do we go from here? And realizing that really they were only found to them, and something I realized like survivor my voice and my story. story that I was going to tell everyone about us, and that I wasn't going to stop sharing about the work that we do and about Kimberly Hurst until I can't speak anymore. So that's, in a nutshell, how I met Kim.
Can you be looking for? It's just sort of,
How do we find you? Are there more of you? You know, where do we go from here? And realizing that really they were only found in crisis, and people were only really getting to them or hearing this name of them when they needed them. And instead of a proactive approach where everyone can know about them before they need, or if somebody were to come to them and say, you know, something's happened to me or something's happened to my friend, and how do I find support? So long story short, that's how I met Kim. And I realized that there was no going backwards for me. And working in this work and in this space, I realized, like survivors like myself, if I didn't know about us and I didn't know what I needed, I was going to make sure that using my voice and my story, that I was going to tell everyone about us, and that I wasn't going to stop sharing about the work that we do and about Kimberly Hurst until I can't speak anymore. So that
reactive. Yeah.
You next.
You're
Sort of anger.
So I'm a physician assistant and have worked in emergency medicine for 20 years. And my first experience in treating a sexual assault patient was in the ER as a student. And basically my attending handing me a rape kit and saying, this is your next patient. And I think, you know, you can probably identify with this, but in med school, nursing school, PA school, there's no education on how to interact or support a sexual assault patient or how to perform a rape kit or anything along those lines. And so I was a little bit like a deer in headlights, to be honest, but that's just, that patient was patient zero for me. I'll never forget her. I'll never forget, you know, she was looking at me to help her. And I honestly felt so helpless and so unprepared. And so that for me was one of the first times that I thought in the field of medicine, like, okay, this isn't right. Like, we can be doing better by this patient population. I worked in the city of Detroit. I was rotating in school in the city of Detroit, but then I went to work on in that same emergency department after I graduated, and continued to see basically just the huge inequity in an underserved large urban area like the city of Detroit. And then I live just north of there in a suburb that's in a different county, but the services that were in the county that I live in were just, again, there was access to free comprehensive medical care as it relates to being able to get a kit done, and medication and counseling. And there wasn't anything like that in the city of Detroit. So when we started, it was just a handful of us in the medical field. I had a medical director that was willing to work with me and a couple of nurses. And we just started seeing patients that were referred to us through the health system that I worked in. And so out of that was just sort of, the name became Wayne County Sexual Assault Forensic Examiners Program, because that's what we did. And it, just made sense at the time. But now you fast forward 20 years, and from patient 0, we're at like patient 18,000 plus. And from, one clinic site and a couple of medical professionals to 6 clinic locations and a full-time staff of 30, both medical and then also advocacy. And really what kind of happened for us over time was that we grew to be way more than just the medical response in that acute crisis moment, to be everything crisis intervention related for sure. But obviously the need was also there. And I know we're going to have an opportunity to talk about this, to be working on community education, to be working on other advocacy pieces, to be working on prevention, and to be trying to figure out why is there this huge inequity too between underserved and other communities, as well as just all of the different pieces that go into the impact of sexual violence on somebody's life moving forward, and those who live with them, interact with them. So there was just way more to be done. And so for us, the name change actually came, it was a couple years in the making, but our final decision and the kickoff to change things to Avalon Healing Center really came through, we worked with some great organizations that helped us develop and sort of come up with the new brand. But really the meaning of Avalon is that it's an island of healing. It has this history of being this island where warriors would go to heal after battle. And we just really thought, like, what more of a perfect parallel to what we're attempting to do, where people, after having experienced such trauma, have a safe place to go to heal. And so that's, in a very brief nutshell, sort of like where we came from and where we are now. And I'm so excited to be here, having an opportunity to talk about not just who it is that we serve and the way that we do that work, but also for those of you guys that are and then in concert with the mission for the global sports development, right, sort of what can we do to prevent this?
Correct. And so, can I just ask you a quick question in follow up to that, Kim, if
Sure.
you don't mind? So you said that when you first were handed that rape kit, you were sort of like a deer in headlights, not knowing what to do.
Yeah.
At that moment, how did you feel about your training when it came to interpersonal violence? Because we know that abuse, any kind of interpersonal violence and distress, has lifelong reverberating effects on victims or survivors, right? And we know that it affects physiology, mental, physical health. It can even lead to things like cancer, rheumatologic disease. So it's kind of a big part of medicine, or should be. So What was your response in terms of the inadequacy of training, I guess? And then how has Avalon sought to fill those gaps? Because it seems almost counterintuitive when we think about the reverberating impacts of abuse.
Well, I mean, it had honestly never even dawned on me until that next chart was up in the rack. Mm-hmm. And I went to grab it and saw what it was and thought, oh, this will be something my attending will see for me. Like I'm not going to have to. And his way of, teaching, and for a lot of physicians, that's it. It's kind of this, usually there's at least a see one, do one, teach one of some kind. However, in this case, it was more of here, this is your next patient. And I'll having to figure out how to open the kit and then follow the directions of what was in the kit. And there was this huge, it was still paper charting back then. And it was like a 20-page chart. And it was overwhelming. And I think in that moment, I just felt like, even though I wasn't prepared, I still just had this feeling like, I think I can do maybe even a better job than what the attending could do, because this patient, obviously to this person, didn't even require, him having to give me any words of advice or like, hey, think about this, or hey, this would be a consideration. There was just nothing.
Mhm.
And so one of the pieces, so, in most, especially where you have a lot of teaching hospitals, residency programs, where most of the healthcare systems have those residents and rotations, where there's a lot of that education going on, that's really where we sought to make a difference in the world of medicine as it relates to, okay, well, there wasn't this there for us, but let's get into the residency programs, let's get into the med schools, let's get into the nursing schools, let's get into the PA schools. And so that's what we've worked really hard over the years to do, because the other side of it is that we're providing those services now for the entire community. So the other side of this is that no emergency department in our community does them on their own anymore. They refer all of them to us. So now there's also this other inequity piece of like the physicians that are going to be going out into other parts of, the country, the state, their communities won't necessarily have the experience, but we're going to be darn sure that they at least have some training and resources so that when they are expected to do one, or they do have that patient. And one of the things that I think is really important is whether you're a physician or whether you are a coach or you are a parent, you will be interacting with individuals who've experienced sexual violence. The statistics are just too staggering. When we talk about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 33 men, it is staggering. And so whether you're actually responding in that crisis moment and trying to help provide support and guidance, or whether you're dealing with them 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, longer, and now they are having, to your point, it's about all of the other, mental health challenges, physiological, true medical and like physical manifestations of that trauma, because they didn't necessarily have the support or the resources when it was happening. So that's, really what we're trying to do, and trying to get people to understand. It's really hard for people to understand that the impacts of this type of abuse and trauma, really, like, you can hear it say like, oh, it's lifelong effects, but really, truly, it is, and it impacts potentially in some individuals' lives almost every aspect of it. And so why not, really make sure that right from the beginning, individuals have and know they have a place, and they know that place as to where to go to help that journey. Because what the research does show is that for those that seek support and feel believed sooner rather than later, they have way less, like, all of the negative, all of, the potential for drug abuse, the increased incidence of suicide, increased incidence of all the mental health challenges. All of that can be significantly minimized if they just have the right support and are heard by those that they disclose to first. So, again, this panel is so important, I feel like, because this gives us an opportunity to be talking about this to people who hopefully haven't needed services like ours before. So.
And real ethical duty of care that you felt to the patient. I mean, it obviously you set off this great bit of momentum that created Avalon. And so we're really grateful for that. And you mentioned something that I thought was really interesting. You said that it's important for athletes and those who've been abused to be believed. Okay, and so Trinae, I'm gonna actually come to you on this one. We know that it's crucial. Obviously, it improves outcomes once those who have experienced abuse are believed. But I'm just wondering if you have any advice for friends or loved ones, teammates, in the case of someone disclosing an assault, or to continue supporting survivors as they continue to live their lives. So the duty of care does extend, from physicians and clinicians to coaches and parents, but also to teammates and friends. And so what advice would you give those teammates and friends who receive a disclosure of assault?
Well, first and foremost, to a survivor victim, that if they're looking to tell somebody, if the first person doesn't believe you, go to the second. If the second person doesn't believe you, go to the third. If the third person doesn't believe you, go to the fourth, because there will be someone that believes you, and you deserve to be believed. So if those persons aren't the first ones, keep going, because in my experience, the first person that I told almost stopped me from coming forward for my impact statement. And this was a person that I, had high respect for. But I realized in that moment that I either needed to go left or I needed to go right, based on their response to me when me telling them my truth. And I almost didn't continue. But I did need to do that, and I needed to stand there, and I needed to be able to speak my truth, and it's led me to where I am. So even just to those that maybe need to hear that, and also if you're on the flip side and someone's disclosing to you, it's not your place to fix this for them. It's not your place to unbreak this situation. It's just your place to just listen. And sometimes that is the biggest gift you can give someone in this kind of experience, is just to be heard. And, in our case, a lot of our survivors weren't believed when they first told somebody, and they didn't give up. Even if they were stopped and stopped and stopped time after time after time, they were strong enough to just keep going, even if that was tons of years of trauma and tons of years of not being able to see past people not believing, just them telling their truth. So, if you're on the flip side and somebody's disclosing to you, you don't have to be anything other than an ear for them. And so I just offer that just as a piece of words of advice to take from this, is that you don't have to fix this for them, but you can change someone's entire trajectory of their life by just listening to them and hearing them, and giving them their power back by simply saying, tell me what I can do here. Do you want me to go, do we want to go to law enforcement? Do you want to go to somebody else? Do we want to not talk about this? Do you want me to say anything? Just giving them the power of their decisions, which is a really important piece of what else I've learned working in Avalon with Kim, because I didn't understand that perspective of my own power and giving somebody else their power to the choices that they make in this situation, because it ultimately was a violation of their rights, their power, their decision making. Something was taken from them. So it was a really important piece that I learned and am continuing to learn, is that giving somebody their power back can change everything for the direction that they go. I don't know if you want to speak to that more, Kim, because I feel like that's part of our.
Briefly.
Any comments, Kim?
No, honestly, I echo exactly what Trinae said, and that, I think what we want people to walk away from this discussion with is having an understanding of, yes, like what do you do if somebody discloses? How do you handle that? And understanding what resources you can connect somebody to, and understanding that they very well may not have any idea what that next step is, right. But that first step was the biggest step, and probably the hardest, one of the hardest anyway, in attempting to address it and deal with it, and move past it.
Right, and there's a whole lot of steps that come before that disclosure. And so I think, looking upstream, Kim, I'll ask you in a moment about the indicators of abuse. But Trinae, you said something that I thought was really interesting. You used the phrase strong enough. And I just want to put a pin on that, because we know that one of the organizational drivers of abuse in sports is specifically that win at all costs, no pain, no gain, grin and bear it, next man up, tough it out mentality that pervades all in sport, not just athletes, coaches, physicians, administrators. It's just sort of a sports thing.
Yeah.
So my question is, how can that no pain, no gain mentality make athletes more vulnerable to abuse? And then what can we do to kind of change, or not necessarily change, but shift the culture? So despite that, we still are addressing abuse in sport.
It's first and foremost conversations like this, because it's in my sport particularly, you were lucky to be able to talk to the head coach in my case. You were lucky to ask questions, and you were only allowed to speak when spoken to. So opening up a dialogue and having conversations like this, whether it's to coaches and parents or to head coaches, to, other coaches, or parents to organizers that run that sport. It even like the Olympics, you look at something so large, and having a realization that they're struggling with these kind of issues, and they're trying to navigate right now situations like Simone Biles. I mean, you have like the top athlete of the whole entire gymnastics world ever. And I feel like she has this mentality right now, like she's got the no pain, no gain, because she's trying to win the Olympics. And really at this stage, she just needs to stay healthy so she doesn't get, but that no pain, no gain is the goal of the Olympics. It's the whole reason that you compete, is to win. But being able to have a conversation and a dialogue about the problems in that sport is giving an opportunity, one, to the athlete to feel protected, but the people that are also facilitating that sport to be able to conversate this issue. Because the more times I regret using strong enough, because I notice those are those things that have been implanted in my brain, those unconscious bias moments that I have, because it's not really about strength. It's just about putting one foot in front of the other when it talks about the abuse. And like you said, that first step, there's other steps getting to that first step, but it's the biggest one and it's the hardest one. And it's literally, for me, looking down at the end of the vault, being ready to run and knowing I have about less than 5 seconds to do a perfect and a strong enough to win. And it's using this sport and these moments like we have right now to realize within the community where it's broken. And there is a very, very part of this that needs work. And so having conversations, putting coaches, having trainings, education, knowing what the athletes are allowed to ask. I mean, why can't a parent ask a coach about certain behaviors with a doctor, or a sports medicine procedure, or how many chin-ups you have to do with a 10-pound weight around your waist at 8 years old? There's just so many pieces to it that no gain, how's it phrased?
No pain, no gain.
No pain, no gain. Oh my gosh. That you have to be the best.
But I mean, Tune, maybe it's a question of just knowing when it serves you and when it doesn't.
Yes.
So maybe it's a question of just us, I love what you're saying about how these conversations and the existence of the amazing Kimberly Hurst and her team and Avalon, where is part of it is just getting the conversation going, normalizing these topics.
Sure.
But then maybe it's, you do only have 5. That's true. You have 5 seconds to do a perfect vault and toss yourself. I can't even imagine doing that. As a track and field athlete, that just sounds terrifying. But I think that's at that moment, maybe it serves you. Maybe that mentality serves you, but then after that moment and before that, maybe it doesn't. So maybe it's just a matter of when it works and where it actually makes.
Yeah, there's got to be a balance, honestly. I mean, and also and what we used to do, we would have sports psychology. So being that as we would compete, sometimes we would go to places that would have blue runways instead of red runways or green. So we would have to visualize changing the color of the floor, because that can impact your competition, those changes. And it's about being intentional, I think, from an organization or from a sport, to put in place different things that they haven't been, whether it is something like sports psychology or sexual assault or any kind of assault for that matter. And what is acceptable from policies and procedures. How do we do background checks on certain coaches? At what stage are the parents allowed to ask about the background checks? There's a lot of different pieces to it as athletics, because you're putting a child, or I guess any athlete or anything that's an organized private space, whether it's religion, whether it's school, even bus drivers, you name it. There's all these different spaces that you can have questions, and you should be able to ask about background checks, and you should be able to ask about the policies and procedures in place, or education to their staff, the coaching staff, to the people that are organizing the events, whether it's the person that's taping off the runway so that people don't walk across it. There's just so many levels that you can go so far.
Trey, you're saying leave no stone unturned, and you're talking about building a trauma-informed culture.
Exactly.
I mean, yeah,
Yes.
no details too small, right?
No
That's
details too small.
brilliant. And you mentioned sports psychologists, and I want to just put a pin on that too, and come back to Kim on this one, because when it comes to clinicians, clinical providers who are in front of patients, we've got psychologists, we've got physicians, we've got physician assistants, RNs, etc. I'm just curious, how, like, from your standpoint, Kim, who out of that group of clinicians comes in front of you, comes to Avalon for training, and what are you training them in terms of what are you telling them in terms of the indicators of abuse in sport? What are you telling them? This is what you should look for. This is what you should be conscious of. These are some of the red flags. So kind of a question of, what kind of clinicians do you have coming through your door? And then what are you telling them?
Yeah, so one of the so definitely it's easier to get to medical professionals, through the schools. It's meaning like the med schools, the nursing schools, the PA schools.
Okay.
And then what we typically end up seeing is like, there'll be like a grand round session, someplace, and then we'll get some attending physicians trickling in. And so, or, we have the academic side of medicine where those individuals are present and hearing this, but until it's really like embedded in curriculum, which is, something that we really have been working with our large universities on, being more intentional around what does this look like to bring into the curriculum. So not only awareness around the issue of sexual violence and the impact on patients' health moving forward, but to your point, being able to identify these things in our patients or in individuals that we're coming into contact with as far as those red flags. And those red flags can look a lot of different ways depending on the circumstances that you're in. And so, sometimes those red flags do come in the form of like physical injuries because of maybe burnout or being overworked. And maybe this is an athlete who normally isn't in the training room, like at all. And all of a sudden they're in all the time, or they have a particular, or they keep re-injuring something. Sometimes that can be an indicator that there's some additional stressors going on. Sometimes there are issues where, you have changes in just mental health, like emotional lability as it relates to somebody who's normally really happy, go lucky, encouraging, positive leader to being more quiet, shutting down a little bit more, not using their voice. Those types of changes can be red flags. Sometimes, especially in youth sports where they're not necessarily like, we're talking right now, and we've mentioned a lot about elite sports and the competition at that level of play. But in youth sports in general, most youth sports are not going to be considered elite athletes, right? They're going to be, in house leagues and things along those lines where these things can also obviously still be happening. And so it may be in the little things where, your son or daughter comes home and they're like, what, I don't think I want to play soccer after this, but they were gung-ho and loved it the whole time. Well, what are, and so then, as in most of these cases, what we're talking about, right, is adults with youth, as the adult in that child's life, having the thought of to start that conversation and say something or ask a question, try to open that door. And maybe they're not ready to disclose anything at that point, but letting them know that, hey, look, if there is something and maybe you don't want to talk about it now, I'm here. You can talk to me, tonight or later or never, but at least knowing that they have somebody that they can talk to. So the red flags can look a lot of different ways. And really, it's just a matter of being in tune to changes in that individual's behavior, maybe even their performance, maybe, especially if it's a coach and they're getting a lot of attention because they're one of the better players or something along those lines. Maybe they themselves kind of, take their level of performance down because they don't want to be recognized by this coach anymore, so it's just a matter of really trying to be observant and watching for changes in lots of different behaviors. Trinae, I know, can share specific examples too of sort of that grooming behavior that is really it's actually, I hate to use the word brilliant, but it really is brilliant on the side of perpetrators that is, how you can really have people in positions, even more so than anytime you have a power and control dynamic, there's going to be, the opportunity for something like this to happen. Doesn't matter the age, doesn't matter the gender, doesn't matter any of that. Anytime you have a power control dynamic along those lines, but in particular, we're talking about adults and children and coaches and athletes, because who are they looking to impress, and who are they looking, they want to play, they want to make this person proud, and they want to get better. So they're with this coach because they believe this coach can get them better. However, there's, the negative side to working with this coach and the silence that accompanies that. I think, just in and of itself, when we think about, the MSU situation, and we look at what's happening at U of M right now in particular, and I think, the amazing things that I'm hoping these brave men will be able to show moving forward is that this is not just women in sport that this happens to, that it is obviously young boys and men in sport that this happens to, and that it really just, if it was talked about, we would definitely be preventing so much moving forward. But it's just only now in the last several years something that we're even really able to talk about. So.
And Trinae, what are those behaviors that we should watch out for that could signal grooming, regardless of gender, regardless of age, regardless of sport, like Kim said?
There's a lot. I mean, I feel like for me, it was hard to identify because I, as a child, watched other people get some of that grooming where it was intentional gifts. In my experience, I had very private, personal, one-on-one, 45 minutes to 2 hours, even sometimes time with my assailant. I literally multiple hours. And they're intentional, like Kim said, it's almost brilliant how they do it, because they're so intentional, and it can take years to groom people. And it is those power and control balances. You have a coach who you're trying to impress, and you have a doctor who's going to help you not be injured, even though you're injured. Right. And all you want to do is perform and be the best, so you get that acknowledgement. There's those imbalances of that power and control that you can see. One, they play off of each other, but the red flags really are, intentional time, private time, gifts, very intentional time with the family, really intentional time that not that you want to say that you can't have a coach that, shows that this child or this athlete is amazing, because that's not the case. And some coaches are really intentional about, giving that kind of gratitude to those players, but it's intentional private time that they put in to make the family, the parents in my case, and myself feel that what was happening was safe, what was happening was okay, what was happening can continue, and that I can facilitate now on behalf of that everybody else that's having red flags, they're okay, because I'm telling you it's okay. They're also grooming me to groom others. So in my case, the grooming was, looking back, extremely obvious. But it's not always so obvious. And Kim, just because you have boys in sports, and I want to be mindful that I'm not missing a very obvious grooming just because I'm looking at my experience of grooming, is there anything that you would drop in that I missed on the grooming? Because I feel like this is a really big piece for people to walk away from, so they're not thinking, what was grooming?
I know.
How did people get groomed?
It's honestly a little bit of a tricky line to where, your perspective on individuals, you don't typically meet somebody and the first thing you're thinking is, okay, how are you trying to abuse my child? Like, that's not what we're saying, right? That's not what we want people to walk away with thinking, right? But at the same time, it's, that awareness piece. And so, and about the sort of gradual and very subtle ways in which these things happen. And in most cases, what you'll hear from survivors, especially who endured multiple years or multiple incidents of abuse, Trinae mentions around like the small gifts. It's one thing if the whole team is getting, you know, a gift card to something, or, you know, a special pin or a special, you know, t-shirt or something, whatever that ends up being. It's one thing when it's, you know, making one person feel, especially for in a team sport. And, you know, that's the other side of it from a gymnastics standpoint. While it's a team sport, there's a lot of individuality amongst that as well. And so it's, you know, those types of opportunities kind of lend themselves to that one-on-one time with an adult who is not, you know, not a guardian, not a parent, and that athlete, to again build that trust where the parents get pulled in. And it's that violation of trust. And so it's just a matter of, you know, trying to physically be there. But, you know, here's the other side of it. In a Trinae's case, a lot of times the abuse was happening and the parent was in the room. Right. But it was happening in a way and that it was still being hidden, and it was still being disguised as something that it was not. And so, you know, the guilt then as a parent or as a person who is involved in a situation like that, it's so unfair because we're just talking about individuals who are very intentional and know what they're doing. And so I wish that we could walk away with a list of, here's 10 things that if these things are happening, you know, this is what you need to be concerned about. But unfortunately, it's way more subtle than that. Yeah. And so, you know, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go finish up.
No, I was just going to say, you know, one of the things that I think some sports have attempted to do at least is from a coaching standpoint, whether it's a parent coach, whether it's a paid coach, having them go through some training so that they can also identify or maybe see what red flags are amongst like people that they're, you know, on the bench with, on the sidelines with, those types of things. There's baby steps that are happening, but I can tell you that it's like you sit online, you take a training, you know, sit through however long it is, and then you're done and that's it. It's never really talked about. It's just a checkbox that kind of happens in order to be a coach, in addition to a background check, and then everything's okay, and it never really gets addressed again, which is not all that helpful either.
Well, too, and just pointing this out because this is happening in the U of M case right now, is that multiple people had tried to come forward about this particular person, and there are enablers that, you know, well, I know there's another panel and I know there's some other pieces to that, but people, if people are being told and they're disbelieving based on the friendship that they have, or, you know, the closeness of that person, or the level of, you know, praise that is that coach, or is that, you know, there are persons, if they're breaking those communication barriers right there, where if somebody's being told, in these cases, people were being told, right, and nobody was taking the next steps to at least try to figure out if you need to bring in law, you know, how to figure that out. And that's like, when going forward, as we're recognizing, looking backwards, we can't do that anymore. If somebody's coming forward about something and someone's being told, again, it's not your job to fix this, but it is a responsibility to at least take notice and or take a next step to at least consider the fact that maybe this needs to be looked at much deeper than you want to look at it. And I think that that's the hard part, is when you think about assault, or at least how I used to think about assault, I always envision it being the white van that had no windows driving down the street. You know, that's what's going to happen. I never in my wildest dreams imagined or understood that it's most likely going to be someone close to me. In most cases, statistically speaking, it's somebody close to you, and it's somebody near and dear, and nobody wants to walk around being skeptical of everyone in your life, particularly if you have children, because that's a heavy weight to carry. But also take into consideration if certain things are presented, like Kim said, there's behavioral changes, there's changes in their drive for that sport, there's changes in performance, there's just things you can notice and take into consideration as you navigate the next steps of, maybe I should just take a look at this, and that maybe going forward, we really do need to consider if people are being told about these things, to not have hundreds and hundreds of people being abused by the same person, even though people were trying to tell people along the line that this person was abusing them.
Yeah, Trinae, it's always the nice guy, right? The nice guy,
Always. Oh,
the nice lady, the nice person, right?
yes,
And that's part of that, like Kimberly was saying, the evil genius of
yes,
groomers and people who are grooming with the intent to abuse, 100%.
yes.
But the thing is, I think for parents and for coaches and for physicians and anyone in sport, I mean, we can't be all things to all people, and we can't all go receive extensive trauma-informed training and understand how to recognize signs and symptoms. And so part of the beauty of Avalon is that the program includes trained advocates to walk alongside survivors and their families and to help translate some of what they're seeing and into words that really fit in the trauma and healing model. And so, Kim, I just wanted to ask you if you could just describe that part of your program a little bit, and then tell parents and coaches who might be watching, who might feel that pressure, like, how could I acquire all these skills? I mean, you don't have to do it all. The trained advocate might be able to take some of that.
So what you'll hear the word like being an advocate, or providing advocacy in lots of different ways. For us in the world of sexual violence, an advocate is typically somebody who is just very well versed in all the different systems that a person who has experienced sexual assault would potentially, be involved in, whether that's the healthcare, whether that's the criminal justice system, whether that's mental health services, whether that's housing, shelter, financial assistance, because what we know again from this trauma is that because of the impact it can have, there are so many potential needs that individuals would have. And so what an advocate's role really is to provide that, in times of acute distress. And the way our organization utilizes advocacy is for crisis intervention in those crisis moments, de-escalation when we have issues around suicidal ideations that individuals are calling and disclosing to us, and knowing the resources as far as what again is in the community that we can partner with, and not just referrals, like soft handoffs to say like, hey, you know what, this person Joe over here is great and this is what he can do, and I'm gonna introduce you to Joe and we're gonna handle this. Or if someone's really not sure whether or not they want to interact at all with any part of the criminal justice system, these advocates are trained in understanding all the different pieces and the complicated ways in which victims can very oftentimes get lost in the system, kind of be taken advantage of within the system, and just be able to be provided with some guidance, support, again, additional resources. A lot of our advocates also do provide counseling. It depends on the role of the advocate and the organization that you're working with as to whether or not that's something that they can do. There are advocates who are trained to provide different types of counseling, in particular, understanding the dynamics of sexual violence and that power control piece, as well as being able to then go so far as to help find shelter, help find, financial assistance because they've been out of work now for 2 months because maybe their assault happened at work, or maybe they just can't bring themselves to go back to work because they're dealing with depression. So it really is sort of looking at the whole person and determining what each individual's needs are when they need them, because this may be something they only need help with maybe for a month, and then there's others who need help for a year, and maybe then they're good for a little while, but then they come back and they need another year or something along those lines. So the advocates really, I feel like, provide this wraparound approach to be able to connect all of the dots and provide it in a way that is, again, when we talk about trauma informed, it's a little bit of a buzzword, but really what we're talking about is understanding what trauma does to the brain from a physiological standpoint, and then what that looks like in the actions of that person, what the emotions are of that person, how that person now processes things moving forward, and understanding that through that lens, that's what we have to provide them. And so that trauma-informed piece that people will keep hearing about is really and truly having that understanding and training behind what happens, and then how do we help provide that support afterwards, and that all of the responses, the reactions, the decisions that are made, whether it might look to somebody else like, well, why would he or she say that? Or why are they acting that way? I would expect it to look like this. It doesn't look like that. It hardly ever looks the way people think it should. And so having that as an understanding is also another way in which we kind of really try to work at, there's survivors, victims, however you refer to somebody or you identify, there's already going to be a lot of self-blame. Like, I shouldn't have let that happen to me. I don't know why I didn't say anything sooner. I don't know why didn't I? And that is just part of, unfortunately, sort of where rape culture comes in to individuals, and why people don't come forward, because they will always come back and think, I should have done something about me. It was my fault. And so, really trying to work past all that, the role of an advocate is extremely helpful to be able to normalize a lot of the behaviors and thoughts that individuals have when they come to us, and they think it's all on them and they're all alone in this. And then for them to find out, like, no, this is a normal response. This is what we see all the time, right? It helps. It just does. And that's what
can I just give one example, Kim, for that? Because we were at our office. So just imagine a regular work meeting going through processes and procedures and such. And one of our advocates, again, this has been a learning experience for me, because I didn't understand and I didn't know what I needed and I didn't know what was happening to me. She made a reference, and she was kind of talking about the responses and the certain levels that a victim survivor goes through in their, it goes up and down, and it can go full circle again. And I mentioned, yeah, I've been having road rage. Like, the old people are so slow and I'm practically going to drive them off the road. And she said to me, and she said, I hear you talk and I recognize that you're angry right now. And I said, I really am. Like, what is wrong with me? And she said, well, you could possibly be at this stage of where you are in your journey. And I thought, I'm about to run people off the road. And I didn't even think that could be a possible trigger or a moment or a behavior that I'm having, because that is so not me. Like, I like to turn up my, but I was, and that, this is just one little example of recognizing within myself, like, certain behavior or certain moments that I'm having these feelings and behaviors that are not me. And she said, I'm just noticing that you have commonly in the last week wanted to do some things that are maybe not like you, and you're having these responses that I didn't even understand, that I'm having these moments that I had no clue were even part of my journey or personal to what would happen to me many, many, many years ago.
Yeah, and Trinae, when she named that, I'm just wondering, back to what Kim said about how sometimes when you put a name on something and give something a diagnosis and say that it's due to structural changes in the brain, it's not a personal issue. What did that do for you? Like, how did you feel about just that knowledge?
Well, first of all, it gave me some self-reflection. I had to just take a break from a sec and realize that trauma that had happened to me a long time is still affecting me. And even though it's very public and I think I'm doing good today, tomorrow I might not be doing so good. And that I have to take self-care, and that I have to understand. It gave me my privilege to be able to notice that I didn't have to be okay, and that I wasn't going to be okay today, and that I need to just take a step back. And it gave me the opportunity to realize that survivors, victims, there's going to be a long journey. It's a lifelong journey. It's not today. It's not tomorrow. It's continuational. It's going to be for always. And maybe, like Kim said, it's going to be this month that victim or survivor is going to need that support. And then maybe they're going to be off the radar because they're feeling okay and that they're supported, however that looks, for the next 2 years. But that 2 years, there could be a trigger. I didn't realize what my triggers were. I'm so triggered right now. I can't even tell you about this U of M case, how triggering it is for me. It is so frustrating, but I'm so proud of those men, because this really does give men an opportunity to realize that they don't have to suffer in silence, that they don't have to stay in that space, and that they can, that it's okay for them to be able to speak out if they would choose to, or if they don't choose to, that's okay also. But it's just those moments of just giving somebody their voice and kind of their opportunity to be able to just say, I'm not okay right now, and that's really not okay, and I'm not okay that that's what's happening right now, and it's making me realize that I'm not okay today. And I'm just sharing this with all of you because it's really triggering what's happening with that case in parallel to what happened in my case. And I'm not trying to compare those two, but I'm not okay this last weekend. If Kim were to tell, and I really am only just sharing this just to explain, like, persons like me on this panel today, I'm giving it my best, but this weekend was really hard for me, really, really hard. And it's okay to not be okay.
Yeah.
And it's okay to not have all the answers. And it's okay to not know how tomorrow's going to look.
And it's extremely courageous to be so transparent. So yeah, appreciate it. But at the same time, it's also, if someone else is listening, they'll hear there's their own story in what you're saying. They realize they're not alone. It's actually a community here. And that's, it's a safe space just in the fact that there's a community of people who can relate. So very much appreciated the example. I wanted to ask him a few questions about the advocates again, because I think that this is probably new information for a lot of people, that advocates exist, that there are people that can walk by your side and tell you, you don't know that you don't know this, but this is what you don't know. And I'm going to help you navigate through. To what extent is diversity of experience really important in that crop of advocates? I'm just thinking now about an athlete versus a non-athlete, person with a disability versus one without a disability. I'm just wondering if any of those little tiny features really should sync up in the advocate and survivor and their family, and to what extent that becomes important for your group.
That's a really great sort of question as it relates to, you know, how do we train these individuals so that they can sort of be that guide through that journey. And the reality of it is that when it comes to the perpetration of sexual violence, it doesn't matter whether it is an athlete or it is, you know, a work colleague that it happened to. Like, the dynamics of sexual violence, while there might be some additional dynamics as it relates to the different types of sports that occur, or Trinae mentioned, you know, like, you know, going to a summer camp or like to a church camp or something like that, the dynamics, all of that other stuff, it doesn't necessarily matter as much as that the dynamics of sexual violence are pretty much the same across the board in whatever context they're happening. And so when it comes to the training that advocates like ours have, yes, there are the small nuances that need to be understood as it relates to maybe the culture of different you know, circumstances or situations that people are in. But again, those dynamics. So as it relates to the training piece, there's always a ton of focus on diversity and understanding that there are all these different circumstances. And so what would those, as the situations play out, what different dynamics are going to come out of it? And again, really, when it all comes down to it, the dynamics are always the same. It's always about power and control, period. And so the understanding that our advocates have around that piece is then what allows it to kind of translate to any kind of sexual abuse, regardless of who it was by or where it occurred or even when it occurred.
Okay, so it's like sports. The fundamentals are the fundamentals. You know, we just had this idea that, you know, it's, I think people, and that kind of brings me to one additional question. Sorry to ask all these follow-ups.
No, you're fine.
Thinking specifically about looking at sport, you know, one of the struggles I've noticed in sport, and I'm not sure, Trinae, if you notice the same thing, but it seems like we always try to do our own thing, like it's some sort of a special space that is different than with some hierarchy and some kind of a goal, you know? So I'm not really clear. I mean, it's interesting why we think it's such a special, different space. I was just wondering, Kim, if you, from what you've experienced with athletes who have been survivors of assault in the sports space, do you have any advice for how sport can come a little closer to sort of getting back to the fundamentals of sexual trauma and fundamentals of trauma? And, or if you've seen any kind of nuanced or kind of weird things from that sports space in all of your experience over 20 years.
So this goes a little bit back to some of the things we were talking to in the beginning about just even having the discussions and acknowledging that it happens. Because I think the other thing that's really, you know, so before I was a PA, I was an athletic trainer and I was an athlete.
What?
So,
Wait a minute. I'm sorry. That was not in your bio.
no, I know it's not. It was a long time ago. I'm old, remember here.
It's a fundamental part of your identity.
So, you know, from having had those firsthand experiences and then correlating to what we're dealing with now, just the fact that, number one, it's already a hard topic to talk about. And in sports, we think, you know, you always think of sports as a positive thing, as a healthy thing, as an outlet, as, you know, that for those of us that have that competitive spirit, which is probably everybody, you know, participating in today's panel, there's all these positives. And so when it's time to have to take a step back and look and acknowledge the fact that all these things that, you know, sports is great. It keeps kids out of trouble after school. It keeps them off drugs. It keeps them, you know, it gives them all these other outlets. But there still is this, unfortunately, dark side of what can happen, again, because of the power and control dynamic. So I think, you know, what I think is the weirdest, when you say like, what are some weird things or what are some things that I've acknowledged or noticed, is that sports is almost really no different from a lot of the other news and media outlets when it comes down to, you hear about it happening in a certain circumstance. There's all this discussion, there's all this, we have to make change, there's all this, you know, response and outrage that this could have happened. And then 2 days later, something else happens completely off and nobody comes back to talk about it again. And so it doesn't really get addressed again. You know, in the wake of some of these things, I've been involved in all these really very well-intended work groups and focus groups and bringing people in as a consultant to try and like change that culture or help build a curriculum. And it has momentum for a little bit of time. And then when it gets hard, then it's like, well, we're going to cancel this meeting and we're going to reschedule it, right? Or, you know, our curriculum is so full. I don't know how we're going to fit this in. We need to, maybe we can give it, instead of, you know, a month, we can give it like 2 days, right? There's just this kind of natural, I think, want to not have to continue to address it and really implement it. And so with all of the positive, with all of the winning and with all of the, you know, the positives that come with it, this side of sports, you know, to really talk about it and to deal with it is addressing, you know, a huge loss as it relates to, you know, what's really happening on the other side of it for the athlete and for the children.
Now, you mentioned the ethos of sport. There's two questions in the Q&A that I'll come to, one by Isabel and one by an anonymous attendee. So what I might do is ask those and then circle back to that ethos of sport that you described.
Yeah.
So the question by an anonymous attendee is really one about a really very deep conundrum. He or she asks, where does a victim go for assistance at the international level? Where do victims go? Where do victims of a popular 30-year veteran sports coach God, whose acquaintance rapes, use the sport to gain access and trust and gets away with it because he has a high-ranking career, police status in his country. Everyone's terrified of him. Going to the police in this country is not an option. They'll do nothing anyways. So this person is really asking, and then there's the dynamic of victim blaming here. When a victim experiences victim blaming, victim shaming, and large scale defamatory discrediting, she's a crazy psychopath, she's lying, etc. Threats of lawsuits. So this sounds very, very deep, complex, and as you mentioned, power imbalanced to the nth degree. We read a little bit about this recently in the Mali basketball team case. I'm not sure if you guys have, if the audience is familiar with that. But I'm just curious if either one of you, Trinae or Kimberly, have some comments for the anonymous attendee's question.
First of all, I think that that's a really important question because as deep and complex as that is unfortunately all too common. All of those dynamics, doesn't matter what country, doesn't matter, you know, the circumstance. And when you ask the question of where do you go, this is that question that we're trying to answer. This is the question of where do you go? And in particular, you know, internationally, there isn't one, you know, standing organization, at least that I'm aware of, and all the work I've done, you know, local, state, and across the country. Well, we may have like national sexual assault alliances and resource centers and pieces like that where you can get resources. the international community is something that, recently through global sports development, honestly, we've been having some more outreach around where do we go, what can we do? And I'll be honest, I'm not very aware of models that would parallel ours that are well known, in other countries. And sort of that's honestly one of the reasons that our model of care as it relates to Avalon and this piece of taking something and putting something into place where it can then be taken by other communities, other states, other countries, other nations, and try to replicate something so that there is a place to go. But I think it just speaks even more so to the toxicity of that power and control dynamic, because I'm sure for this individual sharing the story, whether it's that individual story or somebody else's experience, it feels insurmountable and paralyzing. And I wish I had the answer to that question. And that's one of those humbling questions as well that remind me, this is why we do this work. This is why we have to keep working at this. This is why we have to have these tough discussions, because if we don't start with those, then the silence just continues. And like Trinae has mentioned, and like we've seen over and over again, people do come forward, they do say something, and then those enabling individuals, or again, just like the culture of, a community or a particular, population, it just silences it to the point where that's really then where you start to continue to have all of those negative outcomes for those individuals who weren't believed and who were made to feel like it was their, all them, and that they're just going to mess things up by, rocking the boat, so to speak.
Trinae.
Yeah, I just want to challenge everyone that's on this to see what's in your community and to reach out to, just find out some information about what is in your community, because it will be likely that there's some kind of resource in your community that you're just not aware about. And this is the first time that you're having this introduction to possibilities of options like this in your community. So I just challenge everyone to just see and do some self-investigation of what you might have in your community, because there could be, maybe organizations similar to ours or people that are doing the work that might be totally unbeknownst to you. You have no clue because you didn't have the consideration to just see. But as we go forward, this is such a reminder, and that question I get a disclosure almost every single time I've been on a panel of how and who and where do I go? What do I do? And it's a moment for myself of a reminder that this is why we're trying to do this, and this is why this model that Kim has had, and why I'm stopped my life and changed everything to start working in this work, to make sure that there are others out there that have support, and that as we continue and grow, our organization hopes to go, to the next city and to the next city, and then the next country, But until then, I just really challenge everyone on this to just see and reach out of what's in your community.
Well, and I would also kind of put out there that for those of you who really feel like I don't even know where to start, it's another reason that we're here. My contact information would hopefully be made available. Yeah. Our website will be made available, because if you don't maybe know where to go, or you don't feel like you have the strength to make those calls, and you just don't really want to be the one to call and have to ask questions, and you're not exactly sure what questions you need to ask even, right? That's another reason why we're here, is that, we work to make sure that there are resources. And so if it's something that we can't personally or, firsthand do for you, we can, help do that investigation. We can help. That's what we've done for years. It's one of the things that, our staff is just amazing at, is helping connect people to so much more. And we're able to connect with, connect people with resources that, without, opportunities like through Zoom platforms and things along those lines, you couldn't necessarily find support. But now, you might be able to connect with somebody, and maybe they're in California and you're in New York, but it almost doesn't matter, because you're able to now connect in a way that you couldn't. So in many ways, the world is much, much larger now, but it's also much, much smaller at the same time. And we definitely want to continue to take advantage of these opportunities that we have to connect people. So absolutely, we're here to kind of help try and make those connections if people, have specific questions or specific communities that they're looking to try and find resources for.
I love
Well,
it.
like
And
Kim,
go
sorry,
ahead. Go, Shanae.
I was going to say, like Kim had mentioned, we'll put our emails, and we'll please be, we're happy to help and support, even if you feel you just aren't ready to go there, or you don't even know what questions to ask. But also there's the child help number, and that's 24 hours a day. And that's available as a resource. There are resources, and maybe that this is kind of one of those moments too for all of us to put something together as far as the resources that, we have ours is 24/7, the child help is 24/7. There are emails, there are people that are going to be there for you. So don't feel like you have to do this by yourself. You never have to do this by yourself. I just wanted to put that last little piece out there in the
I love that last little piece, and then that actually brings us to virtual spaces, right? So I was wondering if there were any specific virtual communities that you know of. That doesn't matter if you're in Mali, in South Africa, in Australia, New Zealand, or the United States of America, that you might be able to tap into, potentially as an athlete survivor or as just a survivor in general. And then speaking to that point, just wondering how Avalon is expanding its work, whether it's virtually or physically, because I know both are happening.
Well, I'll be honest to say that I'm not aware of any one particular outlet or organization that's doing anything quite at that level yet. And that's actually one of the reasons that we are working to expand the work that we're doing to potentially be in that place. And so when we talk about expanding our work, that's one of the places that we're working to expand it, is to use technology to be able to reach way outside of the, city of Detroit and, the borders of Michigan and even of the United States. So I wish I had a really great resource to be able to share that at the national level, would be something where it's available no matter where you are at any time. Sexual assault is not quite there yet. There's lots of really great mental health, opportunities, like mental health as a whole, it's aside from, experience of sexual violence and that impact on mental health is such a huge thing at this point in time. And there are a lot of really great resources around that many times, therapists and those that are available through those types of resources do have experience in trauma and international like mental health, I don't know what to call it, group or app or opportunity that, a lot of the times then you can go in and you can actually within the person that you're connecting with see sort of like, what are their specialties? What are they trained in? And if you look for people who have experience, anything that really will kind of lend itself to something along the lines of that trauma-informed experience or lens is some of the language that you could look for that, while it's not really specific and obvious, and that's, unfortunately, like you have to do some of the digging, and that's not what we want either. We want it to be really obvious as to where people go. And so again, I wish I had, a better list right this minute for that, but that's one of the reasons that we're looking to expand a lot of what we're doing in that space too.
Yeah, that's a great starting point.
Better. Yeah.
Well, Kim, too, how we are expanding, it's called the Avalon Institute. It's a platform that we recognize as an organization that we have some of the top experts, people that do this day in, day out, recognize different needs or gaps in the services that we have, and people are asking, and they come to us and ask, how can we become trauma informed, whether it's an attorney's office or whether it's an institution or a group that works with athletes or religious. So we're working on that as we speak. It's called the Avalon Institute, and it's a program that we're trying to do to get these trainings so you can, and we're not fully there yet where I don't want to disclose too much as far as like what is happening currently on that, but it's an opportunity for everyone to be able to come and use us as a resource to get education, to learn a little bit more, whether it's trauma-informed care or whether it's working with children or different spaces that we have as our experts will be putting forth. So I just wanted to mention that one piece because that is just being launched, and we're really intentional of giving support, and that we know that we are trauma informed and we can best help facilitate others become properly trauma informed, not just as like a taboo verbiage that you can actually be Avalon certified to. So we know that we've educated this group or that group on this particular piece of our training.
That's so exciting. And it's going to be a great resource for everyone in sport and outside of sport. And the information is in the chat for those who are listening. There's a 24-hour help hotline there. There's also the website for Avalon Healing Center also in the chat. So please write them down, copy paste. Although Zoom is weird, you can't really copy paste, so just write it down.
And then screenshot.
Yeah. Screenshot. That's perfect. So yeah, so I just, we're coming to, let's see, 19, so we've got 10 minutes. I just want to ask a few more questions, then we'll wrap. So the question you just mentioned about how, trauma doesn't have to be a taboo topic. And I think what Kim said is really important, right? The idea of harm and negativity, it fundamentally goes against the ethos of sport. I mean, it's play and recreation. It's supposed to be fun and bright and healing and healthy. So the question came in the chat, how can we talk to coaches, but it's also parents and each other about trauma in a way that doesn't make people defensive and threatened, but rather invites them in. And I was so interested in your name change at Avalon, because I think that's part of it, right? Sometimes just that positive frame. So I'm just wondering if either of you are able to answer that. I'll start with Trinae, because it really is, it just goes against, it flies in the face of what we go into sport for. But there still must be a way that we can invite people in. So what are some of the tools that we can use to do that?
Well, I think it's all about the context that you address these kind of topics. And sexual assault is a very negative. It is very negative. It's meant to stay negative because it is negative. But it's about the way that you approach introducing and bringing this to the forefront, so that you're not left with it behind you, and that you aren't able to talk about it, and that it's so negative that it's not, like Kim said, you can do these groups, you can do these work groups, you can have all this positive motion, and then it ends because it's so heavy, and you've done so much and you've gotten to this point, but then what? And so first, really just, again, education and bringing this conversation as a everyday intention versus a once every year intention, and not just talking about it because we're talking about it today or because of the case that just happened, but making sure that your group or your sport has this in place constantly. It's talked about, it's refined, it's improved, it's stepped forward, so that it's not just staying stagnant or being left behind.
Yeah, and I think, to kind of piggyback on what Trinae is saying, the issues around, how not only, we're having this discussion and we're talking a lot about coach and parents and the adults. The other really, really hard part, and I can absolutely identify this 200% because I have two young boys in very competitive, high-level sports. And having this discussion with your children, for the parents that are out, that are listening, these are some of the hardest conversations you may have with your kids, and it will not, I don't regret ever having these discussions with my kids at their young ages. I think, they're currently 11 and 13. And I think we started having these conversations back when they were like 8 or 9. And most of these conversations started because of some questions that they asked, but then it was also, we even talked when they were much younger around like just inappropriate touching and that this is your body and you have control over it, even when they were much smaller. And I'm talking like preschool, kindergarten. And, parenting's, they always talk about how hard parenting is. And these, in my opinion, are some of the hardest discussions that you'll have with your kids. But, to help them also understand what might be happening to them will also help them feel more comfortable in coming forward and disclosing to somebody, and for them to even realize that potentially something that's happening to them isn't okay and isn't right. And so, yes, we're really pushing to have these conversations with coaches and with parents and within organizations, but some of those, the most difficult conversations have to happen at home. And that entails, even kids understanding, not that you have to go into detail on certain things, age appropriateness, of course, but this is when it gets into, okay, then what resources as a parent can I turn to? And I think that we need to be doing a much better job in providing the parents with what those resources are, so that they have some tools to use at home to start having these discussions and be able to check in with your kid on a regular basis about what's happening. So, all of those things to be said, there's a lot of work to be done, not only for us at Avalon, but, you know, really just in the world of sports, in the dynamics of everything happening. Unfortunately, this is one of those sides of humanity that nobody wants to talk about. And so, you know, all of these discussions, when we talk about, I see some of the questions in the chat about how can we stop abuse, you know, with disabilities, and can you give me tips on travel sports and like how to handle that? Like it gets really, you know, some of these pieces, especially when you talk about kids with disabilities, right, where you have kids who really are even more vulnerable, right? And even more so oftentimes not able to communicate or necessarily effectively let somebody know that something's happening. So again, the conversation piece is huge, and pushing this more so in the sports community, because there's going to be pushback. People don't want to acknowledge that it happens, but it does. And so again, this is just one of those forums that I have so much appreciation for, because while we, you know, may up there.
Correct. And the thing is, it's thank you for mentioning your two sons in that conversation. Your sons have Trinae's sons beat by about 10 years, I noticed.
Yeah.
Little. And they're, yours are more adolescent.
Yeah.
But the one thing I'm going to say also, though, yes, those conversations are critical. And also the precision care that your organization is taking. It sounds like you take a whole person approach. It's not a one size fits all.
Mm-mm.
You individualize each advocacy effort to suit the person. 1 month, 10 years, 5, whatever they need. In the same way that we take that kind of approach in medicine, it sounds like that might be useful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Thinking about all the various vulnerabilities that this human has, not as an athlete with disability, which is this general concept, but this is a person with a name, a first name, a last name, an address, likes and dislikes, you know, a personality. There's a human in front of you. So yeah, I'm really grateful for your insights there and for your work. So the last question is going to be to Trinae and Kim, because that's your names are next to each other. The question is, you know, what do you think needs to be done really to continue to encourage others to come forward? And then we're, you know, hopefully focusing on solutions. And we mentioned the home training, some of those hard conversations right there in the house. But what additional features or components of daily life and conversation can parents and teammates and coaches and doctors do to help encourage folks to come forward? And then I'll wrap.
Well, I think one courage gives another courage, and honestly, I think it's also giving the victim survivor the choice if they want to come forward, if they want to do that in their experience. In my case, I did, but that doesn't mean there aren't others that didn't and don't ever want to. So it's just a reminder to give them the power and their choice. If they want to come forward, if that's the next step for them. And that we'll be here if and when they ever want to do that. We'll be here.
Kim.
I don't know that I have much more to add on. You know, Trinae kind of said it best, and we've had some really great discussion. And, you know, that's, again, what it keeps coming down to is being willing to have these really hard discussions and find ways in which it doesn't feel so heavy. Which is really kind of contradicts itself, but normalizing it to an extent, as creepy and as uncomfortable as that sounds, right? But what I think, you know, we're just going to always continue to find is that it is just that common, unfortunately. And so that's all we can do is continue to talk about it and try and take these strategies and also grow awareness. That's what this is about, is the more awareness you have, that's when you can really try to prevent it. Because, and the other side of this, which, you know, I know we're coming down to just the last couple minutes, and there are some additional questions. I wish we had more time because there's a lot of really amazing things that we can talk about. But the other side of this is also holding perpetrators accountable. Because if you're not holding perpetrators accountable, then people are going to feel like it won't matter if I come forward, because he or she is just going to continue to do this, or they're just going to get away with it. And so the other side of all of this is, if we're really going to prevent it, the other really important topic to be discussed next needs to be perpetrator accountability. And what does that look like? Because within the criminal justice system, it's messed up and it's really hard to do. And so that's like the other whole side of this, that unless perpetrators are held accountable, I mean, they're just going to keep doing it. It's just going to keep happening, because this is not on us as survivors or victims to fix. This is on, the perpetrators to stop. And so that's, the whole other side of it.
People that are helping those others carry on with this, at some point it's got to stop. And the only way to make it stop is to force it to stop. And those people that are helping facilitate it to keep going.
Correct. It's almost as like in the same way that you need a wraparound healing approach. We need wraparound solutions. Right?
Yes.
That's I think what the Avalon Healing Center stands for. So Mrs. Kimberly Hurst and Trinae Gonzar, thank you so much for presenting with us your expertise, but also your hearts, because they came through loud and clear on this wonderful panel. It's really been a pleasure to moderate and chat with you. And
thank you so much. You've done an amazing job today. Thank you. This was great.
You guys are awesome. Thank
Talking
you.
to friends.
You're amazing.
It's nice to talk to friends, like the Champions Tour. Are good. And all the information is just for those listening is in the chat. So reach out to the Avalon Healing Center as needed. And then we'll keep it going. As they said, they're here. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.